It was a cold October evening. The sky was overcast, casting an eerie darkness over the dense woodland. Mark and two fellow rangers had been sent to search for a missing person, a 23-year-old camper who had failed to return after a solo hike. They had been combing the area for hours, their flashlights casting long, flickering beams through the thick fog. The deeper they went, the more unnatural the forest felt. The usual sounds of nocturnal life, chirping crickets, rustling underbrush, had vanished. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then the radios crackled to life. At first, it was just static. But then, through the interference, came a faint, whispering sound. It wasn't a language any of them recognized. Yet, it carried a tone that made the hair on Mark's arms stand on end. "Did you hear that?" one of his colleagues muttered. Mark nodded, gripping his flashlight tighter. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, though it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. The forest around them was dense, the trees stretching high above, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. Then they saw it. A figure standing motionless in the distance, just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. It was tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for a human. The missing camper? No. Something about its posture, the way it stood completely still, was deeply unsettling. Mark took a cautious step forward. "Hello, we're park rangers. Are you lost?" No response. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, their radios emitted a sharp, high-pitched screech, forcing them to cover their ears. At the same moment, the figure twitched, just slightly, just enough to confirm that it was, in fact, alive. And then, it moved. Not like a person walking. Not like anything human. It was fast, too fast, lurching sideways and vanishing behind a tree, as if it had been yanked out of sight. Silence. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the area with his flashlight. But the figure was gone. Completely. As if it had never been there in the first place. "We need to get out of here," his colleague whispered. Mark didn't argue. Mark and his fellow rangers stood frozen, their breath visible in the cold night air. The thing they had just seen, if it even was a person, had moved in a way that no human should. One moment it was there, stiff and lifeless. The next, it had disappeared into the darkness like a shadow slipping through the trees. "What the hell was that?" One of the rangers, Davis, whispered, his voice barely audible. Mark tried to steady his breathing. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving. The missing camper could still be out here." The three rangers exchanged uneasy glances before pressing forward, their flashlights now shaking slightly in their hands. Every step they took felt heavier, like the forest itself was resisting their presence. Then the whispering started again. At first it was faint, like the wind carrying distant voices, but soon it became unmistakable, soft, unintelligible murmurs circling around them. The words were still indiscernible, yet they carried an eerie cadence, as if something or someone was trying to communicate. Davis turned to Mark, his face pale. "This isn't normal, man. We should call for backup." Mark hesitated. His instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong, but protocol dictated they continue the search. He reached for his radio, but the moment he pressed the button, a loud, distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "Help me." The words were stretched and warped, as if spoken through layers of interference. The voice didn't sound quite right. It was human, but just off, deeper into the unknown, A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Davis and the third ranger, Colton, nodded, their faces mirroring his fear. "It could be the missing camper," Colton offered, though his voice lacked conviction. The three of them picked up their pace, moving toward the way they thought the voice had come from. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing in closer. Every crunch of their boots on the forest floor echoed unnaturally, like the woods were amplifying their presence. Then up ahead, they saw something. A figure crouched low near the base of a tree, partially hidden in the shadows. "Hey!" Mark called out, raising his flashlight. The beam illuminated the figure, a man, hunched over, his back to them. His clothes were torn and dirty, his skin unnaturally pale. His shoulders rose and fell with heavy, labored breaths. It had to be the missing camper. Mark took a cautious step forward. "Sir, we're park rangers. You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." The man didn't respond. Instead, he started rocking back and forth. A strange, rhythmic movement that sent a fresh wave of unease through the group. Colton whispered, "Something's wrong with him." Mark stepped closer, slowly reaching out his hand. "Sir, can you hear me?" Then, without warning, the man's head snapped to the side at an unnatural angle. Too far, as if his neck had no bones. His face was hollow-cheeked, his eyes sunken and black. And his mouth, it stretched into an impossibly wide grin. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The man let out a sound, a deep guttural clicking, like bones snapping together. Then, as if yanked by invisible strings, he jerked to his feet in one fluid motion, and he charged. Panic in the dark. "Run!" Davis screamed. The three rangers bolted, their flashlights swinging wildly as they sprinted through the trees. Behind them, the sound of rapid, uneven footsteps followed. Too fast, too erratic. Mark dared to glance back. The figure was crawling now, using both hands and feet, moving in sharp, unnatural jerks. The grin was still there, locked onto his face like a mask. They ran blindly, dodging trees and leaping over fallen branches. The whispering had turned into a deafening chorus, voices overlapping and distorting, filling the air with a maddening cacophony. The figure was crawling now, using both hands and feet, moving in sharp, unnatural jerks. The grin was still there, locked onto his face like a mask. They ran blindly, dodging trees and leaping over fallen branches. The whispering had turned into a deafening chorus, voices overlapping and distorting, filling the air with a maddening cacophony. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noises stopped. The footsteps vanished. The forest fell silent. The three rangers stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. Mark swept his flashlight around them, but there was nothing. No sign of the figure. Davis cursed under his breath. What the hell was that thing? Colton shook his head. That wasn't a missing camper. That was something else. Mark didn't answer, because deep down he already knew. They weren't alone in this forest, and whatever was out there, it had just begun to play with them. Mark, Davis, and Colton stood frozen in the middle of the forest, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The thing that had chased them, whatever it was, had disappeared. But the silence it left behind was even more unsettling. Mark wiped sweat from his brow, despite the biting cold. "We need to get back to the station," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Davis nodded. "Screw the missing camper, man. If he's out here with that thing, he's already dead." Mark hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave, but something inside him, maybe his duty, maybe just stubbornness, made him pause. Number? We can't just abandon the search. We have to at least check the last known location. Colton shook his head. You're crazy. You saw what I saw. That wasn't human. Mark swallowed hard. I know, but we need to finish the job. Reluctantly, the other two agreed. Their radios had gone silent again, except for the occasional static. The air felt heavier now, as if the forest itself was closing in around them. They pressed forward. After a few minutes, they reached a clearing where the missing camper had last been seen. The moonlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, casting eerie shadows across the ground. That's when they saw it. A backpack torn, half buried in the dirt, nearby a single boot, its laces undone as if the wearer had taken it off in a hurry. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just abandonment. Davis bent down and picked up the backpack. It's his ID still in here. Mark scanned the area with his flashlight. The trees looked wrong, twisted, warped, almost as if they had shifted, rearranging themselves. Guys, he whispered. Colton turned. What? Mark pointed ahead. A few yards away, a trail of footprints led deeper into the forest. But something was wrong with them. The first few steps looked normal. Then they started to change. The impressions in the dirt became elongated, distorted, as if the person who made them had started walking on all fours. Davis took a step back. Nope, I'm done. We are leaving. Right now. Mark wanted to agree. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn around. But then, a sound, a low, deep breathing, right behind them. The horror reveals itself. Slowly, so painfully slowly, Mark turned his head. At the edge of the clearing, standing just beyond the reach of their flashlights. It was there. Not the camper. The thing. Its body was wrong, twisted in ways that defied anatomy. It stood on two legs, but its arms were too long, dangling past its knees. Its fingers twitched claw-like and bony. And its face. It was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin, stretching from ear to ear. Then, it tilted its head in a quick, jerky motion, the same way the camper had before. Mark felt his blood turn to ice. Then it spoke. Help me. The voice was human, but it was wrong. Like an old recording, slightly distorted, warped at the edges, then before they could react. It charged faster than anything they had ever seen. The three rangers turned and sprinted. Trees blurred past them. The wind howled in their ears. The whispering had returned, louder now, overlapping voices chanting something incomprehensible. Then Colton screamed. Mark skidded to a stop, flashlight swinging wildly. Colton was gone, just vanished. Davis spun in circles, panting. Where is he? Where the hell is he? Mark's hands trembled. He pointed his flashlight toward the trees. Then, just for a split second, he saw it. Colton, hanging upside down, high in the branches, limbs contorted in unnatural angles. His eyes were open, but he wasn't blinking, and his mouth was smiling. The screen cuts to black. Heavy static noise. End of segment. Mark and Davis stood frozen, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Above them, tangled in the branches like a grotesque marionette, was Colton. His body was limp, limbs bent in ways that defied human anatomy. But it was his face that sent ice through Mark's veins. Colton's eyes were open, too wide, pupils dilated to an unnatural size. His lips were stretched into a grotesque smile, locked in place, as if something had forced his face into that expression. Davis took a shaky step forward. Colton. No response. No movement. Then, Colton moved. Not naturally. His body jerked like something was controlling him, twisting his head toward them in a single, unnatural snap. His mouth opened, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was a layered sound, an eerie mix of whispers and static, overlapping voices that all spoke at once. Help me. Stay. Don't run. Don't leave. Davis let out a guttural scream and bolted. Mark barely had time to react before Davis disappeared into the trees, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he fled. Mark hesitated only a second longer, his fight or flight instinct screaming at him to run. Then, Colton started laughing. Low at first, then rising into a distorted, inhuman cackle. It echoed unnaturally through the trees, the sound warping as if it were being played backward. Mark turned and ran. Background music intensifies. Heartbeat sounds, fast footsteps, heavy breathing. The escape Mark's lungs burned as he tore through the trees. He didn't know where Davis had gone. He could still hear his distant footsteps crunching through the underbrush, but they were fading. The forest felt endless. No matter how far he ran, the trees seemed to close in, twisting around him like they were moving. The whispering followed him, always just behind his ear. Then, up ahead, a light, the ranger station. Mark pushed himself harder, sprinting toward the small wooden building, its porch light flickering weakly. His fingers fumbled for his radio as he ran. Mayday, Mayday. We need immediate backup. Colton is down. Davis is missing. Something is out here with us. Only static answered him. No time. Just run. He reached the door, yanking it open, slamming it shut behind him. His flashlight trembled in his grip as he scanned the room. Empty. The radio system was still active, but the signal was dead. Then, a thump from outside. Mark's breath hitched. Another thump, closer, then a voice. Mark, let me in. It was Davis, but something was wrong. Mark gritted his teeth, his hands tightening around the flashlight. Davis? Are you hurt? A pause, then, let me in. Mark stepped closer to the window, carefully peering out. Davis stood on the porch, but his face, his mouth was stretched into a grin, just like Colton's. Mark stumbled back. You need to leave. Davis's voice was still his, but layered, as if someone, or something, else was speaking over him. It's watching. Mark's fingers hovered over the lock. Was it really Davis? Was he still in there? Then Davis twitched. His head snapped to the side at an unnatural angle, eyes rolling back for a split second before fixing on Mark. Too late. The lights flickered. The whispering grew louder. Mark turned just in time to see something moving in the shadows of the room. Something tall, thin, grinning. Then, darkness. A loud burst of static. The screen cuts to black. The aftermath. The next morning, a search team was sent out. They found the ranger station door wide open. Inside, everything was untouched, except for Mark's radio, which was crackling with faint static. They never found him, or Davis, or Colton. Only their flashlights, left on the forest floor, batteries still flickering, and one last message found scribbled into the wooden walls of the station. Don't smile back.